Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on results-based financing and output-based aid in education. We will start right away. And I will start first by introducing myself and Nicholas Burnett as presenters. My name is Inga Afanasieva. I'm an infrastructure specialist here at the World Bank, and I joined the World Bank in 2008 and worked on results-based financing and output-based aid ever since. I implemented OBA projects across multiple sectors, including education, energy, water, and sanitation. In 2012, I left the World Bank to work for the Ministry of Education back home in Moldova as Chief of Staff, where I contributed to spearheading the education reform. And this past year here at GPOBA, I worked on the education scoping study together with Results for Development, represented here by Nicholas Burnett, who is the Managing Director for Global Education. Nicholas' recent work has focused, among others, on innovation in education through the Center of Education Innovations, education financing, and innovative financing. Prior to joining R4D in 2010, Nicholas worked for UNESCO as Assistant Director General for Education. He also worked here at the World Bank, as well as for the British government and his own consultancy firm. So we're both here to speak to you today about results-based financing and output-based aid. Before we start the presentation itself, one administrative tip. On the right side of your screen, you can see a chat room. Please write your questions in the chat, and we will collect them as we go through the presentation. At the end, we will answer them during the Q&A session. So feel free to post your questions as they come. I will now give the, hold on, I'll change the slide. All right. So the outline of today's presentation, first we will start with results-based financing and how it is applied in education. We will follow with how output-based aid can be a solution to providing access to quality education. We'll also give you an example of a project implemented by GPOBA. It's Vietnam Upper Secondary Education. And we will conclude with a few key takeaways and recommendations on how to use output-based aid in education. So Nicholas, I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Inga, and my own welcome to everybody. To set the scene for what we're going to talk about, especially for those of you who are not necessarily yourselves working in the education sector, we thought it would be useful just to briefly list some of the major challenges that are faced in education. And there are 6 of these. 3 of them are on the slide you can currently see. First of all, there is still, despite enormous progress, a major access challenge. 1 in 6 children in developing countries will not finish primary school, and almost 60 million children around the world are actually not even in primary school. There's also a literacy challenge. Some 250 million children around the world have failed to reach minimum literacy standards by the time they reach grade 4. And the consequence of the lack of schooling for those who are now adults is that there are almost 800 million adults around the world who are not literate. 2/3 of those are women. Even for those in school, we find that there are big problems to do with their learning. Recent surveys in East Africa, for example, show that over 2/3 of grade 3 students in the 3 East African countries of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda are not able to pass standard 2 assessments. And even 20% of those in grade 7 can't pass those standard 2 assessments. When we think about skills, we find that because of the education system not necessarily equipping everybody with the skills that they need for the world of work, that projecting forwards, as was done by the McKinsey Global Institute, there'll be likely by 2020 almost 100 million low-skilled workers without jobs available, but by contrast, there'll be 45 million medium-skilled worker positions for whom there are not trained people available. Another major challenge faced by the education sector, and very relevant here to our discussion of aid, is the international financing gap. If we add up the resources needed to meet the various international goals, and then we deduct from that the likely funding available, both from national resources, tax revenues and so on, and from existing levels of aid, we still come to a large gap between these two amounts of something over $20 billion per year. And indeed, with the new Sustainable Development Goals, this number is in fact going to be greater, because those goals are more ambitious than the goals that have been in place until now. Finally, not so much a challenge, but more an important feature of the education sector, the private sector, by which I mean both for-profit and also non-governmental and also faith-based education. The private sector has been increasing very rapidly. I will now mention a few of these special aspects of the education sector that particularly differentiate it from some other sectors which have so far been largely experienced the use of results-based financing and output-based aid. First, as I already mentioned, there's a very rapid growth of the private sector. At the same time, education sector is largely public in most countries. Secondly, the costs to households vary dramatically. Even in countries where education is allegedly free, there are actually many costs that households incur. And in some countries, there are also fees that have to be paid, not only at private schools, but also at public schools. There's a particular challenge in measuring results in the education sector. Measuring access is, of course, relatively easy. Are the children in school or not? But measuring quality and measuring learning is much more difficult. There are not easily available, comparable tests and so on that can be used to do this. A further and rather unusual feature of the education sector is that many things actually lack evidence. Many of the interventions that are proposed for the education sector are not well based on evidence, and this raises important challenges about how to do things. However, that also means that focusing on results rather than on the methods to achieve the results might be a promising way to proceed. Education sector is dominated in terms of its spending by spending on people, on teachers. And indeed, the spending on teachers typically account for something like 80 to 90% of all spending in the education sectors. And education is also typically the largest non-military section of the public sector employment. So it's very important, the role of teachers in the economies and in the education system. Finally, costs in education sector are dominated by recurrent costs, indeed by the salaries of those teachers. Capital costs, the construction of schools and so on, are important, but they're much smaller in relative terms than these recurrent costs. How might we wish to think about education interventions, especially if we want to start thinking in terms of possible results against which financing could be allocated? Well, we could perhaps begin with what I just mentioned, that the dominant expenditure item, which you can see at the bottom left there, is teachers. And we could be thinking in terms of, if we wanted to finance the aspects of teachers, we could be thinking in terms of financing their training. We could be thinking in terms of financing incentives for them to teach well, and so on. Moving around to the right, other resources which are important, of course, are schools themselves, physical buildings, and also teaching and learning materials. Then when we start to think about the children themselves, there are interventions that can be carried out to make sure that the children are ready to learn. So these can include such things as school feeding programs like lunch. These can include such things as preparing children through early childhood programs before they reach primary school, and so on. I mentioned already that the household costs can be quite high. There are various mechanisms that can be used to reduce these costs for children and their parents, such as various types of subsidies, scholarships, and so on. Similarly, there is a wide range of things that can be done to manage schools, to provide information. There are different types of pedagogical methods that the teachers can use, and so on. So there's a wide range of things that can be applied. Next slide, please. So now, if we want again to be thinking in terms of how might results-based financing be applied to the education sector, we can think about this in terms of these different interventions that I've just discussed. For example, we can think about it in relatively simple terms in terms of the construction of schools. So that can be, one could be thinking relatively easily there in terms of, right, if X schools have been constructed, then a payment could be made. More importantly and more interestingly would be to start to focus upon outcomes, intermediate outcomes, such as are children enrolled in school, and ultimately final outcomes, such as measures of their learning. How do they do in tests? What sort of literacy rates do we have? And so on. And one can think about this at different levels of the education system, primary, secondary, vocational, higher, etc. One can apply this type of way of thinking. The point here is to be thinking at each stage, what are the results which we could finance against? We've seen quite a wide range of results-based financing techniques applied in the education sector, and we are categorizing them, to simplify this a bit, in three ways. Results-based financing schemes which target governments. That's, for example, cash-on-delivery schemes in which international funders agree to provide cash to payments to governments once those governments achieve certain policy or other objectives. The second category would be those that target service providers, those actually delivering education, those providing education. And here, of course, output-based aid is an important area, and that is the subject we will be discussing later on. A third category is to target students or their parents. And here there are many techniques already being used. For example, conditional cash transfers, whereby payments may be made to families once they enroll and maintain their children in school. There's a considerable experience of these different types of intervention. We list here some that have been carried out in each sort of area. I won't go through them in any depth, but just to point out that some are now quite common, such as the conditional cash transfers. Some are still relatively rare, such as cash-on-delivery projects, which are only so far a few in the world. And also, of course, output-based aid in education are our subject today. But what is interesting also to note is that there is a tendency towards further use of results-based financing in education. The government of Norway has established a new trust fund last year at the World Bank explicitly to promote results-based financing within education. The Global Partnership for Education, a key international institution focusing on basic education in low and lower middle income countries, has now shifted its funding model so that it finances, that 70% of its finances go to pay for inputs, but 30% pay against results that are achieved. So that is an important shift, that a whole institution is now moving towards a mix of input financing and results-based financing. Thank you.
So let's now have a closer look at output-based aid and how it is applied in education. The concept of output-based aid was introduced in 2003 in the World Bank Group when GPOBA was launched as a World Bank administered donor-funded initiative to pilot the approach. OBA has been used across various sectors to date. For GPOBA, this has been primarily the water and energy sector, as well as sanitation sector. The overarching goals of results-based approaches are largely the same, and a common feature across all of them is the disbursement of funds, which is made upon the condition of verification of progress, that predefined results or outputs are achieved. So what is output-based aid? It is a form of results-based financing, as Nicholas mentioned earlier. Under the OBA schemes, the service provider is contracted to improve the education access and/or quality. Because payments to the service provider are contingent upon the achievement of outputs, the service provider bears the performance risk. A distinctive feature of OBA is its targeting of beneficiaries. Remember that OBA payments are made to bridge the affordability gap, and this is why it uses a range of targeting mechanisms to reach the disadvantaged populations. I would like to give now the example of one OBA project to help better anchor the concept. And it is a project that GPOBA has implemented between 2010 and 2013. By way of context, in Vietnam, over the last 20 years, the country reached nearly universal primary and lower education, secondary education. However, about 20% of lower secondary school students do not make it to high school, and 45% drop out from lower secondary school. There are still disparities between advantaged and disadvantaged children linked closely to factors such as gender, ethnicity, and household income. Dropout rates among disadvantaged groups are very high, generally because of economic hardship and low student performance. So how was the project designed? This OBA project was implemented as a pilot. Under the scheme, the East Meets West Foundation served as the implementing agency and grant recipient. The schools, which bore the performance risk by fully pre-financing tuition for targeted students, were later reimbursed upon verification that students firstly maintained enrollment with adequate attendance record, and secondly, achieved a passing grade at the end of each term. In targeting the program beneficiaries, priority was given to students certified by the state as poor, disabled students, Agent Orange victims, orphans, and ethnic minorities. East Meets West Foundation also bore some of the pre-financing risk and had the incentive to minimize the implementation costs, which were built into the scheme. So the foundation had to pre-finance half of the variable operational cost, and that was reimbursed after the agreed outputs have been verified. In this way, the foundation was also incentivized to help participating schools perform. So by the end of the project, 7,500 students have been serviced. Only 2.4% of the students dropped out of school due to economic hardship and/or poor performance, which comes in sharp contrast with the national statistic. Now, after this example, let's go back to the education scoping study and what we found when analyzing the landscape of output-based aid projects in education. We identified 24 projects, either standalone or having components that meet the OBA definition. The projects were at all stages of development, including some completed, other under implementation, and projects that have been scaled up. The goal of the analysis was to identify the factors that appear to be necessary for both effective and ultimately sustainable OBA projects in education. So let me give you a few characteristics of the 24 projects that we identified. Most common location was South Asia, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. Projects were approximately even in their address of primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and vocational education. Most projects focused on multiple levels, which accounts for why the total number exceeds that of 24 projects. Basic education, which included early education, primary, lower, and secondary, represented over half of the projects. The majority of the projects in the database were started within the past 5 years. The pattern is likely due to the fact that results-based financing is a relatively new funding mechanism, and the overall number of projects that have been scaled and sustained remain relatively small. Only 6 projects have been officially completed, and only 2 demonstrated sustainability beyond project funding and were scaled. How has OBA been applied to date based on these 24 projects? The analysis revealed the versatility of OBA to addressing a wide set of issues, including the needs of a particular group left behind, demand-side factors that constrain enrollment and attendance by reducing direct or indirect education costs for certain groups, a particular aspect of the education system not functioning well, often manifested in persistent poor learning outcomes, low internal efficiency, and so on, low levels of accountability of education service providers to deliver certain outputs, and inefficient spending. The projects that we analyzed attempted to improve, in particular, 3 broader areas. One was access to education. The other one was improvement in quality of service delivery. And the last one, improved systemic aspects. So the majority of projects were implemented in countries where access to education remains inequitable. This is the example of Nigeria, Lagos ECHO project, where approximately half of the children from the poorest families do not attend school, or the Vietnam Upper Secondary project that I've just presented, which specifically targeted students from poor families and from ethnic minority groups. One of the key barriers to education access that several OBA projects sought to address was tuition fees or high household costs. Both Nicholas talked about earlier. These preclude a lot of families from sending their children to schools or better schools. And many of these projects that we found subsidized the cost of either tuition or household costs associated with access to education for specific groups of beneficiaries. Secondly, several OBE projects were implemented in contexts where rising enrollment rates reflected recent improvements in access to education, but learning outcomes and quality of education remained low. For example, in Bangladesh, due to the success of the first and second female secondary school assistant project, enrollment rates improved dramatically at the secondary level. However, the same improvement was not seen in terms of quality. This was largely the rationale behind the secondary education improvement project, which came in later and sought to focus more explicitly on improving learning outcomes at the secondary level. And lastly, several OBE projects were applied in contexts characterized by inefficiencies at system level. For example, in Malawi, the Contracting Schools project was initiated where the internal efficiency of the education system was seen to be weak. Around 65% of public resources were going towards paying for repeated grades or schooling of children who drop out before completing their schooling cycle. Part of the objective of the OBA project was therefore to reduce dropout and increase completion rates to address the level of inefficiency in public expenditure. At system level, the study also revealed that OBA is most effective in contexts where service providers or local governments already have a significant degree of autonomy. And one good example of that are the concession schools in Colombia. So what are the key takeaways from this scoping study? First of all, we find that OBA is a versatile tool that can be applied to address issues in education related to access, quality, and system inefficiencies. It certainly is not the only tool. There are many other RBF tools that were mentioned earlier. However, in context with wider school autonomy and private sector participation, where the subsidy is meant to address the issue of access and/or quality of education for a defined group of beneficiaries, OBA may be the approach. Secondly, the OBA projects reviewed under the study targeted poor students. Some were targeting only girls, other projects targeted adults who lacked a complete education, disabled children, and so on. OBA proved to be an effective tool for encouraging service providers, public or private, to target marginalized subgroups of beneficiaries that otherwise they wouldn't. Thirdly, and this will not come as a surprise, but government buy-in is key for project sustainability. Government incorporation of the program into its policy and budget is one way of ensuring the continued existence of the program. A number of factors are likely to increase the chances of government uptake of OBA education projects. One of them is that programs should be cost effective. Cost of donor-supported programs as compared to pre-existing public or private programs may run high. So projects with lowest overhead costs were more likely to continue funding from the government. And one good example of this is the foundation-assisted school program in Punjab, which is run by the government with additional support from the World Bank, was launched in 2005 and continues to fund low-cost private schools on per-student basis if students meet performance standards. And another contributing factor is the fact that programs must be in line with government's funding strategy. Even if the project is cost-effective, ultimately the government must be willing to support it. And one area where this may be of particular concern is for programs involving private schools, as governments tend to focus primarily on the public schools. And the fourth, a key precondition to successful results-based financing projects, and OBA included, is the ability to collect reliable and timely data to track the fulfillment of results or outputs to which funding is tied. This becomes particularly challenging in the context of education, where government systems for collecting information on education outcomes are often slow and in some cases provide unreliable data. And identifying third parties to rigorously and reliably collect data can prove challenging and expensive, as our projects show.
So in the presentation so far, we have focused on the lessons that have come from reviewing the results-based financing projects, and especially the 24 output-based aid projects in education. Finally, we want to just discuss briefly what we think might be some specific areas of education which will be particularly promising for further use of OBA techniques. First of all, which subsectors, which parts of education might be the most appropriate? Well, we would suggest that those in which there is, in fact, very much a mixed system, i.e. a mix of public and private providers. Why? Because the essence of OBA is, of course, that payments are made to those delivering services once evidence is achieved that the services have been delivered. So typically we find that vocational training has a lot of private non-state delivery, skills in general. Early childhood programs are very often provided by non-state providers. Higher education, universities are often both public and private. So these subsectors seem especially appropriate. In terms of target groups, Inga has already mentioned the evidence that this seems particularly appropriate for those who are in various ways disadvantaged. They may be poor, they may be from ethnic or other minorities, they may be girls, they may be living with disabilities, they may be adults. In terms of the particular interventions, there seem to be some which are especially promising. That's in terms of financing outputs in terms of interventions into education. So subsidizing tuition, financing the provision of teaching and learning materials such as books, financing teacher training. These are all areas which can be very appropriately thought about for OBA financing. Finally, what about country contexts? Well, because of the way that OBA results in payments to service deliverers, clearly we need education systems which are decentralized, in which there are, and this is linked to the point about the role of the non-state sector, in which there are decentralized, either autonomous units delivering education within the public sector, or there are non-state schools and other educational institutions. We need contexts, therefore, which are favorable to, or at least not hostile to, the non-state sector in education. So these are some of the areas in which we think that there is a lot of potential for further use of OBA in education. And before we come to questions, we might say that if you want to see the whole report on which this webinar is based, you can find it at this web address.
You can find it both on Results for Development website and on GPOBA website. And now we will be happy to take your questions. We already have a few. Give me a second, take a look at them. So we have a few questions. Let's see how we can address them in the most efficient way. I noticed there's a question on the independent verification of outputs and monitoring and evaluation. And there's a question on the application of results-based financing in fragile and conflict-afflicted states. And I can start with those while Nick looks at what else is out there. On the verification of outputs, in results-based financing projects, including in OBA, IVA plays a critical role because the payments are happening only if the results or the outputs are delivered. So having a very good agency that verifies the outputs is important. And from the projects that we surveyed, the implementing agencies took various forms. In a number of instances, these were governments, units or departments within the government. And in other cases, the implementing agency for projects was a private sector NGO. We had that case in Burundi. The implementing agencies were both local and international NGOs. This could be as well as international companies. As a rule, it's a function that is bid out, and whomever can provide the service at the best cost and quality is hired. On FCS, there's a number of countries where OBA was applied, and they're included in the study, and they're all FCS. And there's a lot of lessons learned coming from there. Obviously, there are challenges, systemic challenges in these countries. What we noticed is that regardless of the setting, school autonomy worked, or systems with broader school autonomy were more likely to adopt results-based financing, and it was working better there. So even in Pakistan, in Punjab region, the OBA project continues to work, and schools have a broad autonomy to achieve the results and use techniques that best work for them in order to achieve the results and then be paid for those.
We also have some questions about which aspects of education might OBA particularly lend itself. So there's one question about, does it lend itself particularly well to access or quality or systems, and what evidence do we have about this? Well, first of all, of course, as the scoping study indicated, there has not been a lot of experience of OBA in education. There were some 24 projects when this study was completed. What we can say from that, I think, is that there is clear evidence that it does lend itself well to access, in terms of that it is relatively easy to assess and to independently verify that students attend school, not necessarily just enroll initially, but attend during the year and so on. And that actually links to a different question somebody asked about the use of technology. Obviously, technology can be used to monitor some of this. You can use, for example, cell phones to upload information to central headquarters organizations about what is going on in terms of the children's enrollment. In terms of quality, there's a couple of aspects of this. There is clear evidence that we can use OBA for quality if we interpret quality as meaning results achieved by students on tests and other assessments, because the OBA payments can be made against those results. If we take a broader view of quality, to do with the whole environment in the school and so on, probably more work needs to be done in order to get at that aspect. There is also some questions about the use of OBA techniques for particular items, such as teacher training and such as teaching and learning materials. So this is a different use of OBA in order to, and RBF, results-based financing, in order to ensure the effective provision of key inputs. So this is not the same as educational outcomes, but this is in order to ensure the effective provision of key inputs. So with regard to teacher training, one could imagine situations in which payments were made as teacher trainees graduate, or as they are employed in an education system. With regard to teaching and learning materials such as books, one can imagine the way that payments could be made against various stages actually of the book supply chain. Payments could be made if there's a shortage of materials, for example, in a local language. Payments could be made once a certain number of books in that language are made available. Payments could be made once books are, evidence is achieved that books have been delivered to schools. Payments could be made once there is evidence, which would be more complicated to collect but can be imagined, once there's evidence that those books are actually being used. So these are some aspects of particular uses of OBA and RBF within the education sector.
I noticed several questions on monitoring and evaluation, on how it is carried out and its cost. So on M&E, on monitoring and evaluation and verification of outputs, it was difficult from the projects that we analyzed to get the cost of this particular activity. For some of them we have, and for some other it was impossible to get. However, from our experience at GPOBA doing output-based aid in other sectors, when looking at the cost of verification of outputs and carrying out M&E, those costs range somewhere between 2% and 4% of the total project cost. When it comes to so typically, what are the M&E structures required for an effective OBA project? So in the projects, again, that we identified for M&E, different venues were used. Several projects used education management information system to gather data as part of the verification project process. And you will see those projects in the study. Among them is the project in Tanzania, in Ethiopia. Some projects relied on school generated reports, particularly when it comes to attendance and tests that were carried at school level. Others relied on national exams data. So M&E data was collected from a diverse from various sources. Use of okay, we covered cost of M&E. Other questions?
There's a question about whether OBA verified data have been other examples where it's been linked to ministry education management information systems. I think the answer to that is really so far no, or not much. Why? Because these education management information systems are typically designed to provide information about the public education system, whereas the OBA examples are more typically financing education through the non-state service providers. So I think that is actually a very interesting question, but it gets at a broader point, which is to do with whether or not countries' management information systems actually cover their whole sector or just the public part of the sector.
I noticed there a discussion started on using school tests, like national level exams, as a reliable indicator of quality. And Peter Holland replied not to use tests for OBA. This is obviously, this opens another topic of discussion of how reliable tests are in measuring learning outcomes in students. It is up to those who implement these projects to select the best proxy to measure learning outcomes. And in some situations, tests are the only ones. Then the question is, how can you make those tests more reliable? This is not to say that OBA would not be a solution. It's all about being intelligent about selecting the best outputs to measure. And yes, sometimes tests are not a reliable or best way to measure learning outcomes. It goes back to the quality of the tests, avoiding teaching to the tests, etc.
Right, and there's some questions also about the limits to the use of these tests, and also the limits to dispersing against academic achievement. Because a questioner rightly notes that achievement is, of course, not just a result of what happens in the school, but is also influenced by other factors. Nonetheless, there are ways in which this can be done. So far we've been talking about simply particular results on particular tests, but we could also envisage, and this has been done, payments against the value added that has been achieved by a particular service deliverer. Thus, this would of course require assessing students before and also at the end of whatever period of education is being used for this system of payment. It could also be done by, but though this could be expensive, it could also be done by comparing the results from service providers within the project with those of service providers, which could include the public sector, outside the project, but who are serving similar populations. So there are various techniques that could certainly be used. They do increase the costs of administering such an approach.
There's also a thread of discussion there started by Gathi, talking about OBA being an incentive rather than a programmatic expense. And I think that is accurate. Remember that output-based aid is one approach in a host of results-based financing approaches that can be applied. And OBA comes in more of an incentive to fix a particular access subsidy implications that it's hard to apply them systemically. And OBA as an approach is used really as an incentive for to address a particular issue of access or quality. However, there are other results-based financing approaches that can be used systemically. And many of you know, a few years ago, the World Bank has introduced Program for Results, another results-based financing tool that is a programmatic tool and works with government to address systemic issues.
Right. But that question also raises an interesting point, which is, what should actually be the balance between financing of financing upfront of inputs and financing against results, because one of the implications of a pure OBA approach, of a pure results-based financing approach, is that the institutions providing the services do not receive the funding until the results have been achieved. But the institutions providing the services may need funding in order to deliver those services. So actually the balance between input financing and results-based financing is a crucial question. I mentioned when we were presenting the slides at the beginning that it's very interesting that the Global Partnership for Education has now moved to a model which is 70% inputs, so 30% results. I think we don't have good evidence yet on what is the right balance, but we can see that logically, if you want to use these techniques, some balance is needed, because, to repeat, service deliverers need upfront money in order to get things done, but also those paying for results want to see the results before they make the payments. So there are some results-based financing techniques that actually are particularly useful for this. For example, the use of social or development impact bonds, in which investors put up the initial money, and then some other institution, an outcome payer, pays against the final results, and therefore the investors recoup their money. But that's also has not yet been, there's so far only one example of that in the education sector in Rajasthan in India.
There is also a question on performance risk borne by the service providers, and it's asked by Sylvester. There is a limit to the extent to which disbursement can be tied to academic achievement. Achievement is influenced by a number of factors that are not fully under the control of service providers. Could you please elaborate on ways that can be used to address performance risk when using OBA approach? So from our experience when doing OBA projects, a lot of emphasis and a lot of work is done before the project is implemented. And partly it's due to the fact that the project design has to be prepared and ready and set before the implementation starts. So it means that all the issues have been addressed with the service provider, and the outputs have been discussed and made sure that those outputs are within the purview of the service provider. The moment the service providers take on delivery of outputs that are outside their purview is the moment when you expose the project to risk, to non-performance risk. So it's all by careful consideration and negotiation with the service providers, and being smart about defining the outputs that are within service providers' control. And that's the only advice I can give. Yeah.
Right. I think while we're waiting for a couple more questions, I might make a comment about the what happens after OBA projects. Because an OBA project, obviously, by definition, the A in OBA is aid. There may not always be aid available to that particular country. So it's very important, we think, to think about this from the beginning. Assuming that the project is successful, how will it be made sustainable afterwards? And so one can think of various ways that could be done. I mean, a different donor could come in and could pick up the payments, but again, that ultimately means that it depends upon aid. So there is an important question then, and this links to the idea that governments need to be involved from the beginning, about whether or not governments may wish eventually to become the payers, which of course would not be then technically OBA, but would certainly clearly be output-based financing or results-based financing. So in the Vietnam example that was presented, although the project was, as Inga demonstrated, successful, what happened subsequently was not so encouraging, because the external financing came to an end, and there was no further financing made available either by another external source or by the government. So it's really important to be thinking, even from the beginning, about how will this be made sustainable.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we noticed this in our projects. Only a couple of them have scaled up, and I mentioned earlier reasons for that. Primarily, the biggest one of them being the cost of the project and the management costs for this kind of schemes. There's a question from Manuela about any experiences with linking the availability of inputs linked to results in RBF programs. So in the essence of results-based financing is to focus on results, the end result that you would like to achieve. Obviously, in implementing the project, you can come up with contractual agreements by which even the inputs towards the results are paid for on a performance base. And that does not prevent anyone from implementing schemes like that. However, as I said, the essence is to focus on the results or outputs that are closest to the outcomes and fund those. Again, they have to be smartly defined, they have to be measurable, because that's what payments depend on. Well, it looks like we've exhausted the list of questions, and we're nearing the end of the session. So what I'd like to remind everyone is that the study is available on both Results for Development website and GPOBA website. We also have a community of practice on output-based aid and results-based financing. You will find the link on our gpoba.org page, and the post-webinar discussion will continue there. So if you have any additional questions or want to learn more about output-based aid in education, please join the community of practice and join the discussion. At the end of this, I'd like to ask you to fill out a survey. It literally takes half a minute, and it's about the webinar and the quality of this. So thank you everyone again for joining. Thank you for the most engaging and interesting questions. We appreciate that very much, and we're looking forward to seeing you at other future webinars on results-based financing and OBA.
Thank you very much.